Hello, everyone, and welcome. Before we start, I have some housekeeping messages for you. English and French audio is available. Please select the channel you require using the Zoom toolbar. English captions are available on the Zoom toolbar as well. French captions are available using the link that we're going to share with you on the chat and is also available on the screen. International Sign Language is also available. Please use the speaker view mode to access. Thank you so much for joining us today for our webinar on Global Accessibility Awareness Day, which is generously sponsored by Facebook. My name is Irene Barry Kirika, the founder and executive director of Enable. I'm very, very humbled to have all of you here today. Disability, accessibility, assistive technology is something that we are very committed to. And we know that in Africa, there are more than 80 million people with disabilities. So I do appreciate all of you joining us today for this session. And I hope we can learn something from each other by the end of it. Enable is a nonprofit organization that I founded in 2009 with a very, very simple mission to empower the blind and visually impaired in Africa through computer assistive technology. Over the last 12 years, Enable has established assistive technology labs across special schools for the blind in Kenya, enrolling more than 9,000 blind students and teachers. So digital accessibility is at the heart of who we are, because without accessible content,
you're right. Just a reminder to tell me when to take down the slide.
Products and services,
Okay. All right, bye.
15% of the global population is left out. Today's event is generously sponsored by Facebook, and we're going to have two panels. One of them is on policy and the other one is on innovations. Both are very important to us because that's the only way we can make progress on digital accessibility across Africa. But before I introduce our speakers, we will hear from Joe Devon, who's the co-founder of Global Accessibility Awareness Day. And Global Accessibility Awareness Day turns 10 today. So over to Joe.
Welcome everyone to the Pan-African Roundtable discussion about the importance of digital accessibility for Africans with disabilities. My name is Joe Devon, and I'm co-founder of Global Accessibility Awareness Day, as well as Diamond. I'm really excited by this panel today. One of the most important ways to further the cause of accessibility globally is to share best practices around the world. Africa is really emerging as the most important player in the next decade, and now is the time to set the foundation for a strong, inclusive, and accessible digital infrastructure. Today, I'm going to be speaking about the story of Global Accessibility Awareness Day. Accessibility is personal, but let's first define what it is. Accessibility is the quality of being suitable or adapted for use by people with disabilities. Global Accessibility Awareness Day is commonly referred to as just GAAD to make it easy. It is celebrated the third Thursday every May, and this is the 10th anniversary. You can have lots of fun by following the GAAD, the GAAD hashtag on Twitter and other social media. And please visit our URL at globalaccessibilityawarenessday.org. Now, what really prompted the creation of Global Accessibility Awareness Day is my dad's journey. And it all began with an indignity. You see, my dad, he survived the concentration camps, and he just commanded respect when he walked in a room. He didn't have to say anything. My dad spoke 10 languages. It all just showed through. He was a Talmudic scholar. He knew the Bible practically by heart and much of the Talmud too, but he was as good at science as he was at biblical studies. And here's a picture of him at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. As he got older, he started to lose his hearing, his vision started to go, banking on the phone became impossible, and it led to a situation where my dad lost his independence because he was unable to bank. Just getting to the bank physically would require using access paratransit, which meant you had to schedule it a day in advance. You had to wait outside in 100-degree heat sometimes for hours, or in a place without a restroom. It was just really impossible. And what was sad is that as a web developer at the time myself, I thought, there really should be a solution for this, and the solution should be on the web. Online banking should have covered this. And I just felt so completely impotent to make any kind of difference, because the bank wasn't accessible. If a bank isn't accessible, well, what else are you going to do? So I wrote this blog post on an obscure blog called MySQL Talk, proposing that we create a day of awareness for people that build digital products, that they should make their products work for people with disabilities. And after I wrote it, I thought nothing much would come of it. But to my utter shock, Jennison Asuncion, who was a blind accessibility advocate in Canada and now heads an important team for LinkedIn, he found the blog post and said, hey, we're going to make it happen. And in 2012, Global Accessibility Awareness Day was officially born. And if you're wondering, if you're thinking about disability like, oh, it's just some random folks, it's a small percentage here and there. And if you think that it doesn't matter, just understand that this event went viral from year one. We had all kind of interesting things happen, from Stephen Fry tweeting it out to India made governmental events. It was syndicated all over Canada, made my hometown paper. There were 16 events from the first year, and it just struck a chord because it affects so many people. Unfortunately, my dad, who really inspired the GAAD event, passed away by the second one on February 16th, 2013. And he left my brother and I, he was the caretaker for my mom, and he left my brother and I to take care of her. My mom had dementia. And when you want to talk about accessibility and caretaking, you really learn a lot if you ever have to deal with taking care of someone with dementia. But the show must go on. And even though I was totally fried, to my utter shock, the community took on GAAD, and lots of companies started to celebrate the event. And we started to collect these NASCAR logo strips, I like to call them. By year 3, the numbers grew. And then an event happened that was the first of many to bring chills down my spine. The very bank that was inaccessible sent us an email, and they said, please don't say anything publicly. And I never mentioned their name publicly, but we know we have a lot of work to do with accessibility. And so we're doing an internal event to improve the accessibility of our websites. To this day, they don't even know that they inspired the event. So this is just to show you, beyond the fact that accessibility affects so many people, it's that if you have a good vision and you have a community behind it, you can really achieve great things. So by year 4, we started to collect more logos, year 5, even more logos. And then by year 6, I couldn't even fit the logos on a slide, let alone track it. It's just grown so big. And let's fast forward to last year, which was year 9. Unfortunately, my mom passed away. She was never really understood what GAAD was. She wouldn't have known the name if you said it to her, because her dementia was advanced enough by the time it started. But knowing my mom, she wouldn't have liked this to only be an event about that really came out of my dad. She would have wanted to be a part of it. And she passed at noon on Global Accessibility Awareness Day, just a half an hour after I dedicated the event to her. And so this year is the 10th year. So let's look back on a few notable moments. Here we have a tweet by Tim Cook, the CEO of Apple, sharing that he invited Stevie Wonder to give a concert on the Apple campus. The big tech companies started to change their homepage for the day, from Microsoft, IBM, Yahoo, Apple. And then one really big moment, which I will leave you with, is this one. Microsoft released this Xbox adaptive controller, and they made a Super Bowl video with these 3 kids who are just incredible. I suggest you go and find that video because it explains better than any way I could. These kids don't want your pity. They don't want my pity. It's not inspirational, which is a common problem out there, that people try to make an inspiration out of folks with disabilities who try and get on with their life. These kids, all they want is to be able to play video games. And if we do our job right, if we consider the craft of digital product development to include accessibility and people with disabilities, we are going to enable these kids to play their game and lots of folks like them to interact with the web and with mobile apps. And if we don't, they won't, and it's shame on us. So I want to leave you with a positive note. We've made a tremendous amount of improvement. We're hitting a Twitter reach of 200 million, which is the active daily user count at Twitter. They all see the GAAD hashtag. The awareness is beginning to get over there, and we're making lots of great strides. So hopefully in the next few years, we're going to see that accessibility is really going to have its moment and it's really going to shine. And with that, I wish you all, thank you for creating a GAAD event, and I wish you a happy 10th Global Accessibility Awareness Day. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Joe. That was a great message, a good story about your journey. And since we are shining a light on Africa, I think we have a very, very long way to go. But the beauty of it is that we've started with our baby steps. I think what we need to consider is that as those who are in tech, anyone who keeps saying Africa is being driven by technology, the question is, how many users are actually able to use the products and services that we are developing? Something can be very beautiful, but it's not usable. So we need to remember that it's important we think about the more than 80 million Africans with disabilities who need to use all the mobile money applications, the social media that we are promoting, and even our bank products. So I definitely agree with Joe that we need to focus on designing products for everyone. And if you design with people with disabilities in mind, you design for everybody. So I'm delighted now to move to the next step and to introduce Mercy Ndegwa, who's the head of public policy, East and Horn of Africa at Facebook. She will be moderating the policy panel. And thank you so much for joining us today, Mercy, and for the generous sponsorship from Facebook. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Irene. We couldn't be more delighted as Facebook to be partnering together with Enable, who have championed a lot of efforts around disabilities, particularly of the visually impaired in the region. And I can't wait to see what more we can do together. My name is Mercy Ndegwa. I'm the head of public policy for the East and Horn of Africa region at Facebook. And I'm really delighted today because on a personal note, I have been a huge champion of digital inclusion and all matters accessibility. But I had my own, let me call them blindness in terms of how I looked at accessibility and inclusion in the past when it came to the digital space. It was not until I actually started working very closely with Irene. I serve on her board, and I'm really pleased to be a member of that board, that I understood how deeply this issue of exclusion of those who have disabilities is in the case of the digital space. And so I'm really happy to be here today to discuss this issue of disability, and particularly with a policy panel, because when it comes to policies, this is where we set up the systems, the laws, if necessary, the structures around how this issue should be dealt with. And I think Joe Devon couldn't have put it any better when he spoke about making sure that we leave nobody behind, making sure that we are thinking about innovating for accessibility for all people, that if we are putting out platforms out there or products out there as the private sector or others, even government, when they're trying to put out e-government services, for example, that there should be some thinking around how to make all of that accessible to people. After all, when it comes to policies, all we're trying to do is usually to solve world problems and make the most impact for the public. As Mercy, I would like to maybe set the tone here with in regards to the introductions for the panel, because I'll be moving to the panel shortly. I would like to describe myself for the benefit of those who may not be able to see me. I would say, I'm an African woman. I would like to refer to myself as a beautiful African woman, but it's not humble to say that, but I think so. I have very short hair that currently looks spiky because it's been curled with, some finger curls on it. But more importantly, I'm currently wearing braces, trying to correct an impairment there with regards to how my teeth bite. But what is most important, I am in a colorful dress this morning because I feel like this is a wonderful day to celebrate people, and it is full of wonderful patterns. I have gone through that moment of describing myself physically because, again, I would like to make sure that even as the rest join me in describing, introducing themselves, that they should include a physical description of themselves so that those who are not able to see them can at least have an idea of how they look. So our first panel discussion will be on the digital accessibility policy landscape in Africa, where again, we recognize that without the right policies in place, we would not be able to effect meaningful change for Africans with disabilities. Today, we know that about 15% of the world consists of the population in the world consists of people with disabilities. There's a huge majority of those who are also within the African continent. So for us, it's a really key issue to discuss. It's a key issue to think about when we are thinking about how we develop products, how we provide services, when we think about how each one in the communities is able to interact and move along in the digital space. Joe Devon has given fantastic examples of banking as a simple example. If you think about using of your mobile device, I think a lot of people now are relying heavily on their mobile device to be able to navigate information that is of interest to them, maybe of hobbies that they have, passions that they're interested in, or searching for information for research. And we have to ask ourselves, how inclusive or how easy is it for people with disabilities to be able to use those services? If you think about a blind person, for example, and the use of platforms like ours, Facebook, how are they able to tell whether a friend of theirs has posted a picture or what the video looks like, and so on and so forth. And so I'm excited that today we'll have an opportunity to also hear from Facebook and from the team that actually is focused on accessibility at Facebook on some of the things that we've done as a company. But again, back to my panel, I'm delighted to welcome them. And I will now ask each one of them to introduce themselves. Kindly make yourself introduction and sharing with us what your name is, the organization you work for or you work with, your role, and a brief visual description of yourself. And I will start with Mr. Lassina. Over to you, sir.
Merci. Je voudrais remercier tous les organisateurs de ce forum. En termes de présentation, je suis Lassina Konaté. Je suis le directeur de l'économie numérique et de la Poste au sein du ministère de l'économie numérique, des télécommunications et de l'innovation en Côte d'Ivoire. Je suis, pour emboîter le pas à notre modératrice, un noir africain de l'Afrique de l'Ouest, bien entendu, taille 1m73, les cheveux coupés à ras, je porte des lunettes pour corriger ma vue. Et aujourd'hui, je suis vêtu d'un costume, on va dire gris, avec une chemise violette et une cravate rouge bordeaux. Je suis heureux d'être fait partie de ce panel, surtout pour parler de ce que les pouvoirs publics peuvent apporter à la situation de ces 15% de la population mondiale qui, rapportés à nos pays, sont une grosse frange de la population qu'on ne peut laisser pour compte dans la société d'information. Je vous remercie.
Thank you so much, Mr. Lassina, and welcome to the panel. Next up is Dr. Wilson Mpra. Would you kindly introduce yourself, then your name, organization you work for, your role, and a brief visual description of yourself. Over to you.
I don't think Dr. Emperor is able to join us currently.
All right, noted. Thank you so much for that. We will then move on to Mr. Jace Nair. Would you kindly introduce yourself and welcome?
Good day. My name is Jace Nair. I am the CEO of Blind SA, which is a national disabled persons organization established 75 years ago by blind people to empower other blind and partially sighted persons. I am the immediate past president of the African Union of the Blind that coordinated the services for blind and partially sighted persons in 54 countries in Africa. I am blind, and it is winter in South Africa. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm sure it's not as bad a winter as the kind of winter that Europe and the US have just come from, but nonetheless, it's winter. Nice to have you, Mr. Jace Nair, welcome. And last but not least, we have Locorito. Sir, would you please introduce yourself?
Thank you very much, Mercy and the organizers of this session. As you've said, my name is Zakaria Locorito, and I'm the Chief Manager in charge of Standards Development and Trade at Kenya Bureau of Standards, which is the national standards body. As it refers to myself, I'm a tall 1.8 meter, and I'm the darkest man on the African continent. Some of you may not have even seen me, but I'm the darkest man on the African continent. Therefore, having said that, I'm also involved in standards development and actively involved, particularly in accessibility standards. That is something that is so close to my heart and to my organization that we need to facilitate this sector. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Locorito. And I'm not sure that you're the darkest, but it's good to note that you describe yourself as such. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for joining. I would like to shoot the first question in the interest of time to Mr. Lassina. And the question really is, how can governments develop digital accessibility policy or legislation that meets the needs of Africans with disabilities and that supports also innovation?
Ok, merci pour j'allais dire, cette excellente question, parce que la journée qui nous réunit aujourd'hui est une journée importante. Il s'agit de sensibiliser, il s'agit de faire prendre conscience d'une situation qui est connue. En effet, l'Organisation mondiale de la santé, ça a été rappelé tout à l'heure, considère que 15% de la population mondiale, soit plus d'1 milliard, vivent en situation, avec des situations de handicap. Ramener, nous, à notre pays, qui est la Côte d'Ivoire, il s'agit de 3 400 000 personnes. C'est une population énorme qu'aucun pays, en tout cas pas la Côte d'Ivoire, ne peut se permettre de laisser en marge du développement, en marge de la société d'information que nous voulons bâtir. Mieux, l'accès aux technologies de l'information et de la communication est un droit reconnu dans la Convention des Nations Unies relative aux droits des personnes handicapées. Plusieurs articles le consacrent. Alors, sur ces bases, notre approche est que les pouvoirs publics ont le devoir de développer et de formuler des politiques et des stratégies pour la prise en compte effective des personnes en situation de handicap, surtout à l'heure des technologies qui constituent un moyen puissant pour permettre à ces personnalités de gagner une certaine autonomie, une certaine indépendance dont les handicaps les privent à certains moments. Alors, pour ce qui concerne la Côte d'Ivoire, nous sommes résolument engagés sur cette base à développer une économie numérique inclusive à travers des actes forts. Déjà au niveau international, nous avons ratifié un certain nombre de conventions, dont la Convention des Nations Unies sur l'accessibilité, pas mal de résolutions concernant les plénipotentiaires de l'Union internationale des télécommunications. Au niveau sous-régional, c'est-à-dire ECOWAS ou la CEDEAO, nous avons participé activement à l'adoption des commissions par la commission de la CEDEAO d'un projet de politique régionale au niveau de l'accessibilité aux télécommunications et technologies de l'information et de la communication, tel qu'élaboré par l'Union des télécommunications, l'Union internationale des télécommunications. Alors, c'est autant de projets pour un accès universel sur lesquels nous travaillons. Il s'agit maintenant pour nous, au niveau de l'État et des pouvoirs publics, de décliner ces grandes affirmations internationales et régionales en loi, en textes qui vont consacrer véritablement l'accès des 15%, donc 3 millions de personnes qui vivent en Côte d'Ivoire dans cette situation, d'accéder aux technologies avec la même facilité que les personnes valides. Donc, ce serait un peu ma réponse à la première question. Il s'agit d'un devoir pour les pouvoirs publics. Il s'agit d'une mission pour essayer d'englober et d'avoir toutes les composantes de notre communauté, de la société, dans le même train, le train du développement et de la construction d'une société d'information qui soit véritablement inclusive.
Thank you so much for that wonderful recap of what is happening from the policy area, at least insofar as your country is concerned and what is happening within the region. And I think that just leads us well into the next question to Mr. Locorito. How can governments develop digital accessibility policy or legislation that meets the needs of Africans with disabilities? The same question that I was asking Lasina. I'd love to hear what your perspectives are, at least from the Kenyan perspective.
Thank you, Mercy, for that question. Picking up from where Lasina has talked, and specifically on the last point, it all starts by recognizing that accessibility is one of the 8 fundamental principles in the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Therefore, that particular recognition by any government, which has been done by Kenya, is very important and the first starting step. And for us as Kenya, we are signatory to that particular convention. And then we have an obligation, as has been stated by Lazina, that is an obligation for us to ensure the rights of persons with disabilities are entrenched in our systems, in our digital accessibility platforms, and in all conventions where normal persons can access. However, having recognized that, then the next step as a government to develop a policy is to involve the right people. Involvement of the people, and how do you engage them? Because we do not want to sit in an ivory tower as a government, then you develop some policies that do not meet the needs and expectations of the people living with disability. Therefore, the next step after recognizing that obligation to develop a policy and enable digital access, the involvement and the engagement of the right people. How to engage the people who are really affected and understand their position, rather than sitting in an ivory tower and deciding on a policy that does not work for the people. Then the next thing, which will be hard for a government to develop a policy that actually meets the needs and expectations of the people, is to reconcile the diverging issues, the diverging points, and reconcile them. And for us who come from the world of standards development, we call it consensus. Consensus, building consensus on what is right and what is the need for this particular policy. Then finally, will be the implementation of that particular policy. Developing a policy is one thing, but we also need to look at practicability of how that policy should be implemented. That's very important, because if we develop a policy that cannot be implemented, then you've done nothing. You need to look at the practical application also of how that policy will be implemented, so that some of the things do not stay for 10 years without being implemented, because and we are moving to the next step of implementing those frameworks that have been put in that policy. That's my submission.
Thank you so much for your submission, which is very detailed. And I love the fact that you've mentioned in great detail how it's important to bring together and hear from the right stakeholders, and making sure that you're also building consensus prior to making the policy or regulation final. or the standard in this case, in your case, Mr. Locorito. Thank you so much, Mr. Lassina and Mr. Locorito, for that policy contextual framework. And I'm curious now to hand over to Mr. Jace to just understand what, from your perspective, would you say is really important for persons with disabilities to be able, how important is it for persons with disabilities in your country to be able to access government information and services online? When you think about, the challenges that they have vis-a-vis what is available, what do you think, how important is it for them to access these services, government services?
Thank you for that. And yes, indeed, it is very important in order for us to have equal opportunities to ensure that we can participate and perform. Sorry, can I just have just a second? There's an interruption in one moment.
That's okay. That's okay. As we wait for Mr. Jace to come back, Mr. Locorito and Mr. Lassina, this question is to you, so feel free to, either of you to jump in. Do you feel that governments have done enough in regards to responding to the policy and regulatory framework around people with disabilities, particularly on digital accessibility? Sorry, Mr. Jace, I just asked another question, so if you could just wait 1 minute to just get a quick response, and then we'll come back to you. My apologies.
Let me take on that one, Mercy. I believe government has taken quite some steps towards that achievement, but we are not yet there. If we recall very well, the UN Convention was ratified in 2006, and then up to 2019, that's when the policy was developed for us as a country. That's a long time that we took to develop the policy, and I believe we wasted a lot of time to move the right direction so that we get the people with disability engaged and actually to come up with the required policy to drive that accessibility requirements. Therefore, as a country, we should move to the first step, but then there's a lot to be done because now we move to the next step of implementation. There are quite a number of things that we need to do for this policy to be fully implemented. Therefore, on my part, I would say we are just at about maybe 20% into this step, but the 80% is yet to be covered. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Locorito. Lassina, do you want to quickly jump in and give us an indication of how well governments are doing?
Oui, alors, juste en complément, je suis totalement d'avis avec Zakaria sur ce qui a été dit et ce qui a été fait. Les gouvernements ont peut-être la volonté de faire quelque chose. Mais le chemin, il reste encore, il est long. Parce que quand on regarde la question de l'accessibilité, on pourrait dire, au niveau des pouvoirs publics, il y a deux aspects. Il y a l'accessibilité à toutes ces technologies qui existent, ces fonctionnalités qui existent déjà à la disposition des personnes en situation de handicap. Et souvent, il y a d'autres types de barrières qui font qu'elles ne peuvent pas y accéder. Sur ce volet, les gouvernements ont réussi à prendre des lois, des dispositions, ça peut être au niveau de l'accessibilité en termes de coûts, l'accessibilité pour rendre accessible ce qui est déjà disponible. Mais l'autre aspect qui consiste à faire en sorte que pour toute stratégie, toute initiative nouvelle, on s'assure de la prise en compte de la problématique de l'accessibilité. Et au-delà, arriver à un moment où on pourra se dire on a suffisamment de textes, de technologies pour inclure désormais les 15% de la population, il y a du chemin à faire.
Thank you so much, Mr. Lassina. And it seems that you both agree that governments haven't done enough yet, but there's progress definitely that we will recognize that has been taken. And I'm sure we'll hear a little bit more about that later. Back to the question that I had for you, Mr. Jace, and I think it leans into this conversation we just had about how well positioned we are in regards to policies and frameworks around enabling digital accessibility for people who are with disabilities. But I'm curious for you to just share with us how important you think it is for persons with disability in your country to be able to access government information and services online.
Firstly, maybe I must apologize for that short interruption. In South Africa, we have very progressive and enabling legislation and policy built on the Constitution of South Africa, particularly in terms of the Bill of Rights, that guarantees access and makes it a offense to be discriminated against in terms of access to the physical environment, access to the digital world, access to literature, and so forth. That is also based in terms of the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability that South Africa ratified with the optional protocol in 2007. Then, in terms of specific legislation, we find that the Independent Communications Authority of South Africa monitors and manages the communication environment. And there's been lots of gaps in terms of accessibility for persons with disability. And ICASA has put out a draft disability guidelines that the disability sector commented on. This includes the broadband, the broadcast, the mobile networks, and so forth. We find that audio description is not covered currently in our legislation. Captioning is not provided as a fundamental right for deaf and hard of hearing persons. So the struggle is there. We have some good policies. We have an integrated white paper on ICT. We have a digital futures strategy. But it seems that the policymakers and the implementers have not got together to make it a reality. We have the white paper on the rights of persons with disability, which was published in 2015 and provides the pillars to support accessibility. We are currently engaging with government and with the disability sector in terms of putting together a National Disability Act that not only would guarantee, but must be able to provide some sort of sanctions to encourage universal access and design. So if products are designed at that level, it would make it much easier to incorporate accessibility rather than modifying it later on. Although South Africa has embraced the fourth industrial revolution, we find that persons with disabilities are not harnessing or reaping the benefits of that. Our learners at our schools are still transgressing both the areas of general education without much technology. The assistive devices that are available are limited to segments. So we find that there's a need to improve practice and policy. There's a need to make more products. For instance, the South African Bureau of Standards is setting standards for accessibility.
I'm sorry.
In terms of ICT, but the majority of government websites are not accessible for screen reading software. Most of the government documents are produced in inaccessible PDF image files. So we find that there's a need in terms of communication to access literature. Our Copyright Act has not been amended since 1978, and it doesn't provide for exceptions and limitations so that we are able to transcribe materials into electronic formats, into a DAISY audio format, or even into electronic braille, so that it could be downloaded on refreshable devices and used. So there is a during COVID, we found that the blind and partially sighted sector in particular had to rely heavily on the public broadcaster to get information about COVID and various lockdown regulations. So information dissemination is a major crisis in the country, and the need for people to access this will enable social and economic well-being. So the disability sector in general have been advocating for accessible banking services, accessible financial services, for accessible publications, to ensure that universal access and design is incorporated into all ICT development in our country. We have a large sector of persons with disability. It's estimated that of our population of just over 52 million, that at least 10% are persons with sensory disabilities. So the need to provide adequate services that will allow for equal participation is very, very important. Thank you. Maybe I will input later on.
That was fantastic. I mean, I love that you enumerated in great detail, not just how important it is for persons with disabilities to access government services, but also articulating very clearly the steps that have been taken within South Africa in regards to this from a policy and regulatory perspective, but also in highlighting the need for the private sector to think about universally accessible solutions when it comes to how they develop or design products and services, and also highlighting the challenges around affordability of devices, and even just how much more there is to do and the gaps that exist in regards to making sure that we are carrying along everybody in the digital journey. And I think that takes me back to hear a little bit, maybe more from Mr. Lassina. From your perspective, would you like to share with us a little more? And I know you've touched on this at a high level when you spoke first, but would you like to share with us what steps you feel have been taken in your country or in the region at large in terms of policy or legislation around digital accessibility, and whether there are any plans to go further than that?
D'accord. Alors, bien entendu, c'est que, alors, au niveau international ou au niveau régional, il s'agit, comme l'a dit Zakaria, de l'affirmation de la reconnaissance des droits de tous aux technologies. Alors, maintenant, quand on essaie d'aller plus loin, donc plus proche de ce qui peut réellement changer quelque chose dans la vie des personnes en situation de handicap, pour ce qui concerne la Côte d'Ivoire, il faut savoir que depuis 2012, c'est l'année de référence en termes des grands changements au niveau du secteur des télécommunications, les grandes réformes. Nous avons dans notre schéma directeur pour le développement des TIC, donc des technologies de l'information et de la communication, un axe stratégique qui est dédié à l'accessibilité. Et cette accessibilité, il faut la comprendre en termes d'inclusion. Et comme je l'ai dit, c'est non seulement les coûts d'accès, c'est l'accès des personnes en situation de handicap, c'est les questions même de genre, mais c'est tous les facteurs qui peuvent faire en sorte qu'une frange de la population, quelle qu'elle soit en situation de handicap ou pas, ne puisse pas accéder aux services et aux technologies. Donc, il y a cet acte qui existe et nous essayons de décliner ce schéma directeur qui va d'ailleurs être renouvelé et remplacé par une nouvelle stratégie qui va être encore beaucoup plus inclusive en prenant en compte des nouvelles problématiques qui vont arriver avec les technologies de la 4e révolution. En 2017, au niveau de la Côte d'Ivoire, nous avons pris une loi qu'on a appelée la loi d'orientation de la société d'information. Et cette loi encore vient consacrer le droit à l'Internet et aux communications électroniques comme un droit fondamental, reconnu et garanti par l'État. Alors, quand on passe à l'opérationnalisation, de façon pratique, ce que nous avons fait, nous avons adopté au niveau du ministère un programme dénommé programme e-handicap. Pour électronique et tout ce qui est handicap. Et ce programme, il comprend plusieurs projets. Des projets pour faire la promotion de l'accessibilité. Et dans ce projet, par exemple, ça va de plus simple. Nous avons développé une charte d'engagement volontaire des opérateurs et des équipementiers. C'est une charte volontaire à travers laquelle ils s'engagent à dire que tous les produits, tous les services, toutes leurs offres prennent en compte la problématique des personnes en situation de handicap. C'est un engagement volontaire. Quand ils signent, ça veut dire qu'ils s'engagent, ils savent que quand ils doivent apporter un produit, une offre, des services sur le marché, en amont, ils se sont assurés que ça prend en compte les problématiques de la situation de handicap. Au niveau de l'État, du ministère, nous avons encore institué ce qu'on appelle une circulaire, une note du ministre adressée à toutes les administrations publiques pour leur dire, désormais, lorsque vous avez des initiatives, vous avez des stratégies à formuler, à développer, assurez-vous que la problématique de personnes en situation de handicap est prise en compte. Voici un certain nombre d'éléments concrets et pratiques que nous essayons d'emmener. Et nous travaillons aussi avec les bureaux de normes et de standards pour arriver à quelque chose de plus concret. Et puis de façon encore plus pratique, nous avons initié un programme d'équipement, par exemple les campus, vers les étudiants en situation de handicap. On offre des centres multimédia spécialisés avec des applications qui correspondent à certains types d'handicap, où ces personnes, ces étudiants peuvent venir et traiter ce qu'ils ont à faire sur un campus qu'un centre ordinaire ne leur offre pas. Quand ils viennent dans ce centre spécialisé, ils ont un accès facile, ils sont sûrs de s'asseoir devant une machine qui a des fonctionnalités qui correspondent à leur handicap. Voici en gros les grandes étapes de ce que nous essayons de faire en Côte d'Ivoire. Mais bien entendu, nous voulons aller plus loin avec la prise d'un certain nombre de textes qui vont non seulement réaffirmer, mais qui vont opérationnaliser cette volonté politique de l'État.
Thank you so much for going into such great detail. And I think it's notable when you think about the United Nations Convention around people with disabilities. I think a lot of countries on the rights of persons with disabilities. Sorry, a lot of countries have already ratified the convention itself. They are in agreement in regards to having it, and I think it looks as though a lot of policymakers feel that it is important to prioritize alongside all other people's rights, the rights of persons with disabilities. And that is a good thing to note. And from what you're saying, it looks like there's a lot of effort and progress that has been made within Côte d'Ivoire and even at the regional level at large to make sure that there's laws that are being put in place to bolster how prepared as countries we are in regards to enabling this. But now I'd like to turn this discussion maybe specifically to Kenya, because Kenya as a country has recently introduced what I'd say is a comprehensive and progressive digital accessibility policy, which is a national ICT policy from 2019 that touches on very important aspects, including how reviewing existing legislation and regulations that to promote ICT accessibility for persons with disabilities. It has gone on to focus on issues to do with requiring basically private as well as public entities to render services to the public, but also to make sure that information and services are accessible in usable formats, as was mentioned by Mr. Jace earlier, making sure that the standards that are being applied or how organizations and entities are looking at their services and products includes and considers persons with disabilities. But I'd love to hand it over to you, Mr. Lucorito, to hear from you specifically. Since your agency is responsible for doing this, what is the progress you've made? What would you like to share with us about what Kenya is thinking about and doing, and what steps you're taking in making sure that these are implemented and practical when it comes to really integrating digital accessibility for persons with disabilities? Over to you.
Thank you. As you rightly mentioned, and picking up from where Lesina stopped, that actually coming to develop the policies, and as we mentioned, we have a 2019 policy that was developed, and one of the fundamental issues mentioned in that policy is to ensure that ICT services and emergency communication are made available to the public, are provided in alternative access formats for persons with disability. Then the next statement, which I can quickly pick from that policy, is that it should ensure that websites of government departments and agencies comply with international web accessibility standards, and I'm stressing specifically standards because that's our mandate, and are accessible for persons with disability. Therefore, quickly picking from the policy, as I mentioned, developing a policy is one step, and the next step will be the implementation of that particular policy. Therefore, towards implementation, as a national standards body, CAPS, we've worked together with Enable to come up with the roadmap on how we are going to achieve those intentions that are outlined in the policy. And for us, together with Enable and other stakeholders, we've identified ICT accessibility gaps as the first step. And from those gaps, the next step is to identify the accessibility standardization gaps. And our team at CAPS, together with Enable and other agencies such as Communication Authority, we've been able to identify those standardization gaps. Therefore, the next step, which we are going to move with speed to achieve, is to develop the National Workshop Agreement on ICT accessibility standards. It's a process that we've started working on it, and within the next 6 months, we should be having the National Workshop Agreement on ICT accessible standards ready and up by the National Standards Body. Then going forward, if we've done that one, we'll need to develop a monitoring and implementation plan for this project, because we need to develop those national agreements. Then the next step will be, how are they practical? How are they implemented to enable those persons, like the websites that have been mentioned in the policy? Therefore, we are going to develop that monitoring and implementation plan for this project. Then we also need to develop and build capacity for various stakeholders to enable the equipment to be available, to enable that awareness to be created across the stakeholders. Then finally, we intend to do to carry out a research and development for continued improvement of the standard. Once we implement and we find there are gaps to be filled, we shall go back and look at those standards again. The beauty with standardization is that we're not starting from scratch. There are already established standards in other policies, in other countries, in other places where we can start working. Therefore, it's something that we intend to move with speed and realize the intentions of the national ICT policy. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your wonderful insights, the entire panel. I knew even as we started that this was going to be electrifying. I'm really, really impressed at the detail and how much is happening already in the space. I'm really, really humbled even to note that we're making such important strides as policymakers towards this. I would like now to switch gears a bit just to pick up on some of the questions that are being asked by the audience, because I think, and just for the audience's own information, if you have any questions, please feel free to throw those into the chat window, and we will pick those up and ask them to the panelists. So I think I will start with you, Mr. Lassina. There is a question to you regarding cost and just a second, sorry, I have to scroll through this. My apologies. As I try to find this, I think I will ask a different question to Mr. Jace because he was already on earlier speaking to us about this. I'm just curious to hear from you, Mr. Jace, whether you think, is technology being a key economic driver in Africa? What do countries in Africa need to do to ensure that they have inclusive ICT policies so that Africans with disabilities are not left behind? I know there's aspects of this that have already been answered, but if you have any specific sort of like recap points, it would be really helpful, even as I scroll through the questions for the rest of the panelists. Thank you.
I think certainly the African Union over the last 2 years adopted the African Protocol on the Rights of Persons with Disability. And there are a few countries still in Africa that have not ratified the UN Convention. And I think it's important that firstly, as civil society organizations, we advocate with our governments to ratify both those instruments, and for the AU to develop a more integrated ICT policy. And in addition to developing these policies, I think there needs to have a rollout plan in terms of how do we activate our officials in the African governments to understand the concept of universal access, the concept of international standards on accessibility in all walks of our life, so that they make these policies available at national and regional level, but also then to empower persons with disabilities to access the resources, to firstly understand the policy framework and what it would do for us, but also to create pockets of excellence within our countries, so that we could maybe have best practice models that we could share with each other, and to see what works well, and share that knowledge and that information. So I think it's about us working together in networking and lobbying, disseminating information widely to the policymakers, so that they can start to effect the necessary changes both at the regional and national government levels.
Thank you so much. I would like now to focus on the questions from the panelists. I think the first question is from Paul Mugambi, who would like to know what policy frameworks or decisions can be taken to address especially the issue of cost when it comes to accessibility of digital devices. And I think I could have either Mr. Lassina or Mr. Locorito answer this question.
Je peux... Alors, c'est sûr, ça rejoint peut-être la question aussi d'un panéliste qui disait que les coûts et l'accessibilité sont trop intimement liés pour être séparés. Donc, c'était ça la question au niveau du forum. Alors, c'est sûr que coûts et accessibilité, vu du côté de l'industrie, ça va être très difficile de séparer. Mais les pouvoirs publics, notre devoir de toutes les façons, étant donné que les droits, ce dont nous parlons, c'est des droits des personnes à un certain nombre de services comme toute autre personne, il va falloir trouver les mécanismes. Et certainement dans une concertation avec l'industrie, avec les acteurs, avec les personnes en situation de handicap, on peut toujours arriver à des solutions pour trouver le meilleur équilibre. Et ça a été, comme ça a été justement signifié par M. Diès, il est plus intéressant en termes de coûts d'anticiper, c'est-à-dire que l'industrie intègre déjà la problématique en amont plutôt que d'avoir à adapter des produits existants à des conditions de handicap. Ça coûte plus cher. Et c'est pour ça que l'une des missions au niveau du pouvoir public également, c'est de sensibiliser, c'est de prendre des textes, et notamment la circulaire dont j'ai parlé, la charte volontaire, c'est d'amener les opérateurs, les équipementiers, dès le départ, à dire tout ce que nous devons proposer, il faut qu'il y ait la problématique de handicap. Quand c'est intégré en amont, je pense qu'on peut trouver la meilleure solution à la problématique, coût et accessibilité.
Sorry, Mercy, if I could also add, I think cost is or affordability is a very crucial issue in terms of having devices, particularly assistive devices. And I think it's the responsibility of governments to provide incentives for research and development, to ensure universal accessibility, to ensure that they subsidize products so that there's funds created for this purpose. And we would also encourage the private sector to also invest in research, whilst investing in research and development, to be very mindful of universal access and design, because if at the foundation phase of developing a product, you incorporate accessibility, it is much cheaper than the cost of making it adapted or modified later on. Government should also provide tax rebates and other benefits to ensure the investment in accessibility, so that we have better products available in the market, more products made available in the market, so that the scale of the scale of economy at this stage makes it very expensive to produce these items. So there must be some of these incentives provided to encourage entrepreneurs and developers to be creative. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that wonderful addition. And I think I've seen a lot of not panelists, but attendees who are asking questions around whether it's possible to separate costs from accessibility. And both yourself and Mr. Lassina have answered this in such great detail in regards to how closely these two are tied, and the need for there to be solutions from both private sector and government to ensure that these costs can be brought down significantly. And I think to wrap up our session, I would like to finally ask a question to Mr. Locorito, again from an attendee who's asking how accessible, how augmentative, I think, and accessible communication devices. Sorry, this question, I need to reread it. Are there augmentative and accessible communication devices that GAAD has certified in Kenya? If not, why?
Thank you very much. I had responded to that question on the chat window already, but I can take it on again. I did respond that as a national standards body, we do develop the standards. Then when it comes to certification of products, we have different regulators that do certify products. But of course, based on the standards that have been developed. And for us as a national standards body, we do not develop standards on our own. We involve the stakeholders who understand the requirements and the needs and that need to go into those standards. And once the standards are developed, then we push them to the regulators to implement them. The responsibility of certifying communication devices lies with the communication authority. And of course, we work with them closely to interpret the standards that have been developed, so that when they are certifying those products, and then they conform with the requirements of the standard. Therefore, I believe most of the details and devices that have been certified will be obtained from CA, Communication Authority of Kenya. And also, having said that, I have seen quite a number of questions on the chat also asking about certification of the products and why are we not certifying certain products from entrepreneurs who have met the requirements. I would be glad to receive the specific requirements, and as the national standards body, our door is open. Therefore, we receive specific requirements, then we can evaluate them against the standard. And if there are deficiencies, then we advise the entrepreneur to work on the redesign so that they meet the requirements of those products. Therefore, we do not dismiss anybody, but we try to encouraging entrepreneurs, advising on how to meet the requirements. And once they meet the requirements, we do certify those products. Someone mentioned about the quality of the canes and other devices like wheelchair. Then quickly going back to those ones, again, we have standards already established for those products, and we're working with the International Organization for Standardization, ISO, to develop more standards in this field to ensure that actually digital accessibility and the other services are accessible for all. That's my contribution.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And I see that you proactively went through all of the questions that have been asked by attendees. It's impressive that you can juggle both paneling and answering questions. Thank you so much for doing that. I think I would like to close this panel at this point to just do a quick recap. It looks, from the discussions here, it's very key for policy to play a role in defining what the framework for digital accessibility would look like and what it should be, and the implementation of that for those persons living with disabilities. And that's really appreciated and has been highlighted in detail. And I think there is a number of in-country as well as regional efforts that are being put towards this. I have appreciated the points that you've made around the affordability of devices and how closely this is tied to actually making sure that persons living with disabilities are also able to access digital devices or digital services better. I appreciate also the points around the need for there to be very clear standards around even to determine, for example, issues like quality, for example, of these devices, to determine the implementation of these policies and processes on the ground. I've appreciated the very strong point that has been made concurrently throughout the conversation around bringing together different stakeholders. So this is not a problem that should be solved only by policymakers on the government side, but also having private entities or the private sector coming in to support with finding solutions around the gaps that are still existing in regards to digital accessibility for persons living with disability. And I think if I could wrap that there, but if there is anyone with final remarks that would like to make them, please feel free to do so in 1 minute. Otherwise, I would love to hand it over back to move it along to the next item. But I'll pause for a second in case somebody has final remarks.
Thank you. I think, Marcel, picking up quickly, my final remarks is that the last statement that you've made that working with stakeholders is very important. And for us as a national standards body, we've opened up the participation in national standardization to all stakeholders. We are already working with National Council for Persons with Disability, ABDK. We're also working with Enable to bring all the stakeholders onto one table and develop those required standards. And for us, time is of essence, and we are moving with speed to ensure that we implement the policy as passed in 2019. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Mr. Lassina, Mr. Jace,
oui.
Any final
remarks? Alors, je dirais simplement que pour tout ce qui concerne les droits des citoyens ou des hommes dans un pays d'une façon générale, c'est un devoir pour l'État d'apporter les solutions qu'il faut pour avoir toute la population, toute la communauté dans le même train. Donc, la question des personnes en situation de handicap, la question de l'accessibilité est une question de droit et chaque État doit pouvoir jouer sa partition.
Thank you so much, Mr. Lassina. Mr. Jace, would you like to make any final remarks?
Yes, I think just to say that I think, involving people with disabilities is essential to finding the solution. So I think engage with persons with disabilities to understand what the challenges are, and thereby start to develop solutions that could meet the needs and the standards of persons with disability. Also important, I think, events like this to create awareness with decision makers, with the research and the development personnel, with the manufacturers and other persons to make sure that accessibility is understood and there's more awareness and information shared about it. So I'd like to thank Enable and Facebook and the panelists and the audience for supporting this initiative and to look forward to greater initiatives in the future. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And mine is to thank this panel for, again, being so insightful and being so informative. And we've built a lot of knowledge. And I think from you sharing so candidly and in such great detail, it has benefited all of us in thinking more reflectively about our roles and how we can participate in ensuring digital accessibility for all persons living with disability, but also all people altogether, as Mr. Lassina noted earlier. And so with that, thank you so much for your participation. And I would like now to call up the next item, which is a video that will be played by, that shows Mike Shebanek, who is the head of accessibility at Facebook, speaking to us about what Facebook is doing on accessibility. Thank you so much.
Hi, I'm Mike Shebanek, the head of accessibility here at Facebook. I want to thank you for joining us today. Accessibility is fundamental to achieving our corporate mission, which is to give people the power to build community and bring the world closer together. And it's paramount to achieving true digital inclusion. Facebook serves nearly 3 billion people globally, and that's an easy number to say, but it's breathtaking in its impact. And within the Facebook community, there are hundreds of millions of people who rely on assistive tools and technologies to experience the information and connections that happen on Facebook. We like to say that our journey is only ever 1% finished. It's a way of reminding ourselves to never rest or be satisfied, and that there's always opportunity to improve and advance. And this is true for accessibility as well. We are always listening and actively engaged with disability communities, looking for ways to improve the accessibility of our products. Our engagement with disability communities around the world informs how we advocate, represent, and raise awareness of people with disabilities and our work to promote economic opportunities and employment. Today I want to share with you 3 themes that I think you'll find in our accessibility work: awareness, action, and advocacy. Let me start with awareness. The disability community has a popular saying called "nothing about us without us," and we take this to heart. So for us, awareness begins with research, engagement, and consultation with disability communities. Here's just one example. In January, we launched a major update to one of our signature features called Automatic Alt Text. It's powered by AI and computer vision and creates text descriptions of photos on Facebook automatically. But before this launch, we ran multiple rounds of research, not just to learn how people were using it, but how they wanted to use it. We conducted surveys, one-on-one interviews, did early prototyping, and even ran multiple experiments. What we learned was interesting. People wanted access to deeper details about an image, like the count of recognized objects or the position of objects in a photo and their relative size. But not all the time, only for the photos that interested them. So we responded by creating a new feature that provides these details on request only when they're needed. And ultimately, as a result of all this research, we were able to improve our image recognition by over 10%. Sorry, not just 10%, by 10 times. We also know that the importance of sign language for the deaf and hard of hearing community, and recently took our accessibility research team on a 9-day trip to Brazil to learn firsthand how being deaf or using sign language affects a person's interactions on social media. As a result, we not only better understand how this community is using video clips as an easy way to share and communicate in sign language, we also got a much deeper appreciation for the level of difficulty of simply holding a phone or staying in camera while signing. Now, what we learn from engagements like this changes how we think about future product features and our roadmaps, and also reinforces some of the decisions we've made. Our portal communication device turns out to be well suited to address this need. It has a built-in camera system that automatically adjusts focus and keeps you in frame even when you're moving, which makes it perfect for sign language. Now, we also continue to work closely with disability rights and advocacy organizations to understand the most pressing needs of the disability communities and how Facebook can better address them in its products, tools, and advocacy. So how are we turning awareness into action? Well, last year, we completely re-engineered and modernized the Facebook website, which enabled us to improve the experience for people using screen readers. Screen readers are an assistive technology that enable people who are blind and low vision to understand and use mobile apps and web pages. We simplified and reorganized heading tags that are used for navigation. We improved the accessibility labels, and we redesigned the keyboard shortcuts to make them easier to find and use. Over the last year, we also made significant improvements in captioning. In addition to enabling people to manually upload captions to a video, We also provide automatically generated captions powered by AI at the touch of a button. We even provide caption editing tools so creators have full control and can tune these captions if they like. With the growth and popularity of video blogging and live streaming, especially as we've all been learning, working, and staying in touch remotely, we recently introduced auto-generated captions for live events. So now people using FB Live, Workplace Live, and Instagram's IGTV can enable captions for their audiences in 16 languages. And we'll be including support for captions in our recently announced suite of audio-based applications. We're also continuing to improve accessibility in our family of apps like Instagram, Messenger, and WhatsApp. In fact, just a few months ago, we enabled a talking camera experience in WhatsApp on iOS, so screen reader users can hear a spoken description of what's in the viewfinder to better frame their photos and videos. But we're also actively engaged in advocacy, advancing accessibility even beyond Facebook. In 2020, Facebook was the first company to take the Global Accessibility Day pledge, committing publicly to making React Native accessible. This mobile app development framework was originally created by Facebook, but we turned it into an open source project, making it available to everyone. And now it's used by hundreds of mobile app developers who've created thousands of apps with it. We're also working to advance accessibility technology standards through the World Wide Web Consortium, known as the W3C. Standards may not seem like that they're that glamorous, but this work is critical to enabling the robust, consistent, and reliable web and mobile app accessibility experiences that we're all striving for. We also co-founded and continue to be active members of the Teach Access initiative, bringing together industry, academia, and advocacy to gather and transfer accessibility best practices from industry back into education, so the next generation of technologists are better prepared to create accessible experiences, and we can achieve the goal of ensuring that all future technologies are born accessible. We're also a member of the XR Association, which is dedicated to publishing and advancing policies for safe and accessible extended reality products like AR and VR. Recently, Facebook was a key contributor in the development of the XR Association's Developer Guide for Accessibility, one of the first references of its kind. Speaking of XR, we're on the cusp of some truly incredible opportunities for advancing accessibility. We've even been researching the use of something called electromyography to create technologies that will make it possible to recreate the strength and dexterity of a person's hand in a virtual environment, even when that's missing or extremely limited in the physical world. We're pretty excited about the future, and as you can tell, we're hard at work advancing disability awareness, action, and advocacy on multiple fronts, both inside and outside Facebook. But we also recognize there is still a lot of work to do, and it's an honor to be leading this work at Facebook and to be working so closely with so many disability communities and advocates around the world. So on behalf of Facebook, we look forward to continuing this journey together. Thank you so much for your time.
Irene, I think you're on mute.
Thank you so much. Before we start our second panel, I'll do a quick visual description of myself. Thanks to Mercy for reminding us about accessibility. So I have braids on, and I have an 8-year-old daughter who says she's chocolate, but she believes I'm brown, so I'll go with brown. I'm wearing a black top, and my braids are black. So, and I'm wearing red lipstick. So I hope that will help those who are visually impaired. And I hope our speakers who come next can also give a brief visual description. Now over to a quick reminder on the accessibility support that we have available. One is the English and French audio is readily available. Please select the channel that you require on your Zoom toolbar. English captions are available in the Zoom toolbar as well. And then for French captions, please use the link that's on the chat for you to be able to have access to the French translation. We also have international sign language. Please use the speaker's view to access that. And moving on to our second discussion, which will take a close look at the innovations landscape for digital accessibility and assistive technology in Africa. So I will start off by introducing our speakers, I'm very delighted to welcome our panel. And I will ask each person to just give a brief introduction and describe yourself within just 1 minute. And before maybe we move to the first person, I want to acknowledge Bernard Chira, who was committed to being on this panel today. And he's very, very passionate about assistive technology. He also has a disability himself. He does a lot in the African continent. He had a last-minute emergency, so we wish him and his family well. We hope everything turns out good. Next, we can have maybe Dan, followed by Farida, and then Magdi. Please do your introduction.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Irene. My name is Dan Ball. I'm the Director of Global Connectivity and Access Policy for Facebook. I am a white man with a shaved head. And for the first time in, if I did the math correctly, 15 months, I am wearing a tie. Look forward to speaking with everybody today. Thank you.
Excellent.
Hi, my name is Farida Bedwe. I am a disability rights advocate. I am a technologist. I am a software engineer, and this is the hard part, describing myself. Okay, so I am chocolate colored as well. Depending on the chocolate you are eating, of course, that is highly subjective. But I also have braids, curly braids, and I'm wearing a pair of blue glasses and some orange, yellow and blue earrings and a yellow and blue dress. So I think that is it in a nutshell.
Thanks, Farida. Yeah, Magdi?
Hi everyone, my name is Magdi Shahir. I'm from Egypt. I'm the Student Life Director at the Royal British International School and also the ambassador of one of Egypt's prominent foundations for the integration of people with disabilities in the Egyptian society called HIM Foundation, and an international motivation speaker. I'm light-skinned and very excited to be on this panel to discuss assistive technologies and how we can advance forward in the Middle East and Africa.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Magdi. So I will ask this question to Farida, and then Magdi, you'll answer the same question. Can you tell us about what is happening in the digital accessibility and assistive technology landscape for, of course, Farida, you'll answer about Ghana, and then for Magdi, you'll give us some more information about Egypt, but also feel free to touch on the continent. I'm sure you know more about what's happening across Africa. Thank you.
Thank you, Irene. So what is happening in Ghana? That is a very good question. Unfortunately, not that much, although there are a few companies who have done interesting innovations. So there is this company called Assistive, and they have a text-to-braille web platform which converts text to braille real time. Then they have another app for mental health issues, and yeah. Then there's another one called Tech Era, which does learning management software for blind students. They also produce pencil books for those with mobility challenges in their hands. And yeah, so that's basically it in a nutshell. But I've been talking to a lot of people about their possibilities and their advances in assistive technology, and hopefully, I hope that a number of people with technology background would be interested in that area. The challenge is that most people with disabilities in this part of the world do not have that much spending power. So for a firm to go into assistive technology, it has to be either donor funded, or it has to have a grant of some sort to be able to support their research and their innovation. So that is it in a nutshell.
Okay. Magdi, do you want to answer before?
Yes, of course. From the Egyptian side, we do have assistive technologies coming up on the surface. Of course, it's not really a very prominent thing. It's a working process here in Egypt. But we do have assistive technologies. For example, if we're going to tackle for the visually impaired, we have an application that lets the visually impaired know exactly what they're looking for. If they need to, for example, the money, to identify the different bills, and basically, if for clothes, it tells them different colors, and it basically gives them an orientation and mobility of anything they're interested to know in their surrounding area or anything in general. And also with regards to the foundation that I'm part of, that I'm the ambassador of, we have an application called Intolic. It's an application that lets people with disabilities know the places that are accessible to them. So for example, if you're a wheelchair user, you would open the application and the application would tell you which places in Egypt are accessible for a wheelchair user, like for example, which places have a ramp so that you can easily access the ramp. And also the application tells you how many stairs are there, is the bathroom wide enough or not, is there an elevator, so that when you enter the place, you feel like this is my place. I feel integrated and it's totally accessible for me. So in terms of, again, to emphasize, in terms of assistive technologies, we do have some assistive technologies and some prominent assistive technologies that are coming out on the surface in Egypt. And we do look for more assistive technologies in the future, because in Egypt we have a huge number of people with disabilities, from 15 to 17 million. So if we can actually assist them and make their lives easier, they can add a lot of value to the Egyptian community at large.
Excellent. Thank you for your input. So what I find interesting, just from my own experience and observations, is that Africans are very innovative. And the digital accessibility assistive technology space is very advanced in the first world countries. So we are many, many years behind. But what is interesting is that there's a lot that we can sort of adopt and move on. We can sort of leapfrog. But there's also a lot that we have to innovate and come up with our own solutions as Africans. And the momentum for assistive technology is pretty slow. And from my observation, I tend to think that education is a big problem. So I feel that anyone who's investing in disability in Africa, in accessibility in Africa, education should be a priority, so that at least local people are well educated about accessibility and assistive technology, so that when they come up with solutions, they completely understand exactly what we're working on. So I do feel there's huge room for growth across the continent, which is a very good place to be, because you can only develop more and more innovations. But I feel that education will be the enabler, or will ignite the whole innovation space in the assistive technology space. So thank you so much. Let me move on to the next question. And Farida, later on, feel free to jump in when it comes to what you think about education in the assistive technology space. Next, so as we have an expert today from Facebook, I want to talk briefly about social media. It's a very, very important communication tool in Africa. I think we know most Africans love social media, but many people don't know how to make their posts accessible for people with disabilities. So maybe the first question I'll have for you, Dan, is what is Facebook doing to support innovation in accessibility for Facebook users with disabilities? And can you share some examples?
Yes, thank you for that question, Irene. First, I'd like to thank you and your colleagues at Enable for organizing this Pan-African Roundtable, and thanks to everyone for participating. It's really an honor to be speaking with you and to be part of this panel. Our mission at Facebook is to give people the power to build community and bring the world closer together, and that means everyone. Our goal is to make it possible for anyone, regardless of ability, to access the information and connections that happen on Facebook. One significant barrier, as you just mentioned, Irene, is the lack of awareness around the needs of persons with disabilities and the various accessibility tools and technologies that are available. As you heard Mike mention, we are a co-founder and active member of Teach Access, which is a collaboration between industry and academia and advocacy organizations. We seek to advance the teaching of accessibility in higher education with the goal of ensuring that graduates are prepared to build technologies that are born accessible. We aim there to help bridge the gap between what people with disabilities want and need and what's being designed and produced. Of course, consultation with people with disabilities is fundamental in this process, as Mr. Jace noted. Another barrier that we see is overly prescriptive regulation, which can be a barrier to promoting accessibility, particularly considering the rapid pace of technological development and the emergence of new tools to enhance accessibility. As the first panel mentioned, it's important that regulators pursue a harmonized approach that builds upon existing technical standards, such as the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, or WCAG. This will allow the efficiency and scale necessary to make accessibility features more widely available. It also avoids the fragmentation of technical standards that could create conflicting requirements.
Fantastic, thank you. And I'll ask you the same question, but more focused on users. What barriers has Facebook encountered in making the platform more accessible for the users? And maybe even just understanding images and stuff like that. What are some of the challenges that you've experienced?
So great question. I'd like to focus on a couple of the technologies we have to address particular disabilities and challenges. First, automated captioning for the deaf and hard of hearing. Several years ago, we launched a tool to enable users to manually add captions for video and to customize the way those captions appear. But not everybody takes time to add captions, and our goal is for every video on Facebook to have them. So we committed to making large investments in and leveraging artificial intelligence, or AI, to enable automated captioning for video. This makes it simple and easy for creators to add captions, and we strongly believe it's one of the best ways to make captions available for videos on Facebook. It's now available for Facebook ads and pages, Facebook Live, Workplace Live, and Instagram TV. We've also developed automatic alt text, or AAT, for the blind and visually impaired. The standard practice for describing photos to people who are blind or visually impaired and who use a screen reader is called alt text. It's a short text-based description that's used by the screen readers to describe the image. But adding alt text takes time, and the vast majority of photos were posted by people who didn't know how to do it or didn't know why it was needed. So we developed automatic alt text, AAT, which uses AI and object recognition to generate a description of photos for people using screen readers. The original version, launched about 4 years ago, could recognize about 100 objects, like a tree or mountain or outdoors. We're very pleased to have introduced earlier this year version 2.0, which increases more than tenfold the number of objects that are recognized, and also provides additional context about photo contents.
Okay. Fantastic. Thank you so much for your input. My next question will go to Magdi. What are the barriers to innovation when it comes to digital accessibility and assistive technology in Egypt?
We have quite a few barriers, especially if we're going to talk about Egypt at large. We have a huge percentage of people with disabilities that are illiterate. If we're going to talk about the poorer part of the society, which makes a bigger portion of the overall society. These people have actually no access to any digital digital communication at all, actually. So for them, they don't really understand what it means to have a digital database in the first place to begin with, let alone having it assistive or accessible. So a way of reaching out to them would be important because they also compromise, as I mentioned, a huge percentage of the Egyptian society. So this is one aspect of the difficulty. We also have another aspect of the difficulty. It's basically the inability for people to the lack of knowledge that people have in Egypt in general about what does digital accessibility entail. Like what do you need to have in order to have an accessibility in the digital society. I feel in Egypt we need to spread more awareness on this issue. Like, what are the tools that a person with a visually impaired would need to feel integrated into the digital society workplace or workforce in general, or society at large. And also, if we're going to talk about the different types of disabilities, the hearing impairments, the people who have mental disabilities, for example, for sign language and all that stuff that it's also digitally available. I don't want to say that it's not there in Egypt, but there's still a huge gap that needs to be filled. Egypt had in 2018, it was the year of disability, announced by President Al-Sisi, who made the year kind of shed more awareness on the importance of integration and the importance of disability, and that we have a huge percentage of people with disabilities and that we need to have them better integrated into the society. So people started to understand more about disability and more about the concept that each disability is different and the way of tackling each disability is different. But there's a lot still that needs to be covered. But I would say on a final note in this issue, we are well on our way to having an inclusive society, but there's still a lot of work to be done. And with help from everyone, from the country, from our neighboring countries, and all the people who help Egypt, we'll be able to achieve a lot. And of course, through the Hal Foundation, which is a foundation I'm very proud to be part of, we'll be able to achieve a lot, just like we've achieved a lot on the ground, we'll be able to achieve a lot more.
Irene, you're on mute.
Irene, you're on mute.
My goodness. Thank you. I was talking to Farida to see if she can add some more input on what Magdi said about Egypt. There are additional barriers you can think about, barriers to innovation on digital accessibility and assistive technology in Ghana.
Yeah, there are a lot of barriers in terms of the social and cultural terrain that we face as people with disabilities in this part of the world. So you are considered as second-class citizens, and you are not really considered in various aspects of policies and all that stuff. I mean, the disability bill was passed in 2005 in Ghana. Up to now, it still hasn't been implemented. So there's a lot of talk, but no action when it comes to disability issues. We know all the things to do, but we don't have the political or whatever willpower to get it done. Now, so apart from that, because of that, a lot of people with disabilities are not being educated, because all the inclusive education policy has been put in place since 2013. It hasn't been implemented properly. So the schools are not equipped to be able to handle children with disability. So when a child with a disability goes to a school, the headmaster or the headmistress has the right to tell the parent that I cannot accept your child because I do not have the facilities in place to take care of the child. So we have a huge educational gap between those without disabilities and those with disabilities in this part of the continent. And I'm sure it's the same for other West African countries. So those are some of the barriers when it comes to disability access. Apart from the fact that most people still think that it is spiritually, that it's a spiritual curse or something when you have a disability and all those things, you have to fight the barrier of sometimes you're not even accepted by your family and all those things. So you have a lot of barriers to surmount before you come to the aspect of digital inclusion and all that. But on a positive note, awareness is being created. There are a lot more. I think that there are some protections in place for people with disabilities, which were not there about 10 years ago. The pace of change is very slow, but I can see there's a lot of improvement in the past 20 years since I started my activism and all. And I would like to ask Dan a question about Facebook accessibility, if you may permit me.
Okay, go ahead.
Now, when it comes to accessibility, most people think about the hearing impaired or the visually impaired, and they forget about those who are not hearing impaired or visually impaired, but have motor-related disabilities. So, for instance, using myself as an example, I have cerebral palsy, which affects the motor development and my movement. So for me, when I had to transition from an ordinary phone to a touchscreen phone, it was very difficult for me. I had to force myself to learn how to touch the exact portions of the screen that I needed to touch because that was the way forward. A lot of people with some of these challenges may not have the privilege of being able to force themselves to learn those things because of how expensive their disabilities are. So I would like to find out whether you guys have taken into consideration those other disabilities, because you cannot talk about accessibility and forget about disabilities like that. Thank you.
Yeah.
Matt?
Yes, please. Thanks, Farida. Go ahead.
And thank you so much for that question, Farida. You're absolutely right. Mobility disabilities are an important limiting factor on being able to participate in social media, in education, work, cultural events, civil society generally. And it is something that we are also working on at Facebook. We have a lot of efforts to ensure that input devices are more accessible. That is making sure that various forms of input devices, joysticks, eye trackers, things of that nature, are able to interact properly with Facebook and the different Facebook services. Even going beyond that, I think Mike Shavanik made some mention of this, but we think there is tremendous potential for AR/VR to assist people with mobility disabilities. We have, and first of all, I want to recognize that we currently don't sell our AR/VR products in sub-Saharan Africa. They're still at an early stage. Last year at GAAD, so a year ago, Mark Zuckerberg, our founder, said, virtual reality and augmented reality is all about giving people remote presence. So if you're long on VR and AR, and on video chat, as Facebook is, you have to believe in some capacity that you're helping people to be able to do whatever they want from wherever they are. Enabling remote presence with family and friends, enabling remote work and civil participation are obviously essential, but accessible virtual reality need not stop there. We believe it will support virtual reality simulations that allow people with reduced mobility to explore inaccessible real-world environments. This is an area with tremendous potential for people with mobility disorders. Does that answer your question? Is that helpful?
Yeah, it was helpful, especially when you talk about things like eye trackers and all those other devices. The challenge, another challenge is that most of the people with some of these disabilities will not have the funds to be able to afford these high end devices. So I mean, even mobile phones is costly for some of these families. So if you are talking about eye trackers and VR equipment and all those things, unless it is heavily subsidized for people in this part of the world, it's not going to be affordable for them. So I would like to suggest that when you are coming up with some of these solutions, you take into consideration some of these potential clients and the fact that most of them may not have the spending power right now to be able to afford some of these solutions, but some of these solutions can transform their lives and make them more independent and become contributing members of society, which is what we all want for people with disabilities.
That's absolutely essential to our approach to accessibility, to ensure that the people who are going to use these products have input at the beginning. So we know what they want and how they want to use it. I should also mention that we have products like the Facebook portal, which is designed after setup to be pretty much hands-free. We're trying to make the setup part easier as well. But after setup, it can be voice controlled. It has a camera that will follow the speaker. So if you have somebody else join you in a conversation, it knows to turn to you and basically becomes fairly hands-free again after this setup. But okay, couldn't agree more.
Now, one last point on voice control, because as you can see, my speech is slightly slurred because of my disability. Mm-hmm. How sensitive are your voice control software to be able to pick up slurred speech and all those things? Because a lot of people with cerebral palsy and other neurological conditions have slurred speech, and because of that, most of the voice control systems do not recognize me when I speak, because of a combination of the slurredness of my speech and my accent. So you have to also, put those into consideration when you are building some of these solutions. I'm a software engineer, so I know all these things are possible if you want to make it possible.
You're absolutely right, Farida. I think most people would say that the technology right now is not good enough. It is something we are aware of and are working on.
Yeah.
But we do recognize that that it's not where it needs to be ideally useful for people with slurred speech or other speech impairments.
Yeah. So thank you so much, Farida, Dan, for responding to that. I think you raised two very important issues. And one of them, I think, Farida, was more about cost, because assistive technologies are expensive. But when I think about Africa, I think about the next billion users that every company, every tech company is trying to acquire. the reality is the users are in Africa. So it's very, very critical for the product designers and product developers to really understand the users in Africa. We may all, there are certain things that we can use in a uniform manner, but there are certain things that Africans will have different requirements or different ways of using. So I totally believe in designing for the people. Like you raised a good issue about your accent. And that's a very, very critical piece of you when you're using technology. So there's definitely, I'm more passionate about making sure that when companies or businesses or investors are investing in disability, you try and think about the full ecosystem, whether it's the education piece, it's the development piece, because what we are having is that sometimes we have a lot of employment projects, but you don't have education. Then you hear people saying, you know what, we don't have qualified people with disabilities to join. So it's the same thing. If we're going to ignite the innovation spark in Africa on assistive technology, we need to invest in innovation, and partnerships will help along the way. And I think my question flows to Magda. Magdi, accessibility in the first world is very, very advanced, as we all know. What do you think Africa needs to do to be able to take advantage of the current innovations in the first world, but most importantly, innovate for the African market? And how do we leapfrog to the next level?
Sorry, my mic was muted. First of all, we need to learn from the experiences of the first world countries. Kind of take samples of how they're going about, and follow through with that, and also from another angle, try to create a survey or create some kind of questionnaire and ask the people with disabilities themselves, and of course putting into perspective all the different types of disabilities that we have, and seeing what are the exact assistive tools that they would like to have, so that we can tackle the whole spectrum of the 15 to 17 million people with disabilities that I mentioned in the beginning. The thing is, we might discover through the questionnaire or through the survey that some of the things already have been done in Egypt or have already been established. But the good thing about having a questionnaire or a survey is that any extras or anything additional that's not there can be implemented in that sense. And I would also talk more about, or emphasize more about, I should say, in the first panel the speakers were talking about how we should mention, or we should, when we analyze the situation of assistive technology for people with disabilities, we should look at, or we should ask the person with disability, him or herself, to find out what are the best solutions and what are the best assistive tools, because they understand the best in that respect. And also, it's very important to take into consideration all the different types of disabilities, as I mentioned before.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. So because of time, I would ask our participants to give us an extra 5 to 10 minutes and we will wrap up. I'll have one last question for Dan, and then we can go ahead and take a few questions from the participants. So Dan, can you share with us some tips on how Facebook users can make their content more accessible to people with disabilities? And the reason we are asking this question is because people are constantly posting and posting and posting, not realizing there's 15% of people who cannot consume the information you're posting. So some very simple tips that can help just a basic user understand what to do, or to make sure their content is accessible.
Yes, thank you very much, Irene. And you're right, it's so easy with a few simple things in mind to make what we post so much more accessible. We're trying to do that on the technology side with AAT and captioning, but there are things we can all do every day. It starts with using simple language. Whenever possible, use simple language and shorter sentences. Longer sentences are harder to track and understand. Use sentence case in your sentences, which is the normal capitalization we use, instead of using all caps, for example. It makes it easier for people with cognitive and learning disabilities to read these things. If you're using hashtags, capitalize the first letter of each word. That makes it easier for screen readers to be able to pronounce the hashtags correctly. It's important to consider colors when posting content. You don't want to have, you want to maximize contrast. You don't want to have dark captioning over a dark surface. When it comes to photos, please consider adding alt text to your photos. Keep the description short. For example, walking in the park with my new dog. For audio and video, please use and encourage others to use captions. It should include sound effects and other noises that take place in the video. We're working to make that easier. They can be automated, as I mentioned, in most instances, including live video, but you still have the option of changing the captions and putting in your own captions. Just those few simple steps will make a big difference.
Yeah, and maybe I can add one more thing just to see, maybe we may be able to help more people. I think if you look at the trend for websites lately, there's a tendency, we're all going towards a white background and a gray font. And then the font size has also reduced quite a bit. So for the web designers, web developers who are listening to this, please think about color contrast, because you don't want a white background with very light gray. What that means is that when someone gets on your website, they'll just, within 2 minutes, they'll skip to the next thing, because it makes it very difficult for someone to be able to read the content. And this does not apply only to people with disabilities. This also applies to just any regular person. I could be reading the content on your website outside and the sun is out. So if it's all gray on white, I will not be able to read anything. So it's just about making sure that we improve on the user experience. So thank you so much, Dan, for that. And I will move on to questions from our participants. Let me see what we have. Actually, the first question is for you, Dan, again. What is Facebook doing? What Facebook is doing is great. However, what measures do you have in place to ensure that we all know how we can make things more accessible for persons with disabilities on your platform? And the second question is, how can people report accessibility issues when they come on the platform? You're on mute.
Another great question. So we just recently launched accessibility at support.whatsapp.com. For accessibility issues on with the WhatsApp platform. So we encourage folks to use that if they have a question, if they have an accessibility related question. I would encourage people to consult our accessibility Facebook page, facebook.com/help/accessibility, and to also follow us on Twitter. At FB Access. But those resources are really one of the best things I can recommend for resolving accessibility issues and understanding what services we have.
Okay, great. Let me see if we have one more. Someone says it's great to hear about innovations on the continent. I know that South African Federation of the Disabled in South Africa has developed an assistive technology information for mapping project. It's called AT Info Map. So the person wanted to create awareness on that. And with that, I would like to give 1 minute to the panelists so that we can have some closing remarks because of time. Thank you so much. Maybe we can start with you, Farida, and then Magda, then we wrap up with that.
Okay. Thanks so much for inviting me to be part of this panel. It's been a pleasure to interact with everybody here. And I'm really happy to hear what's happening in Egypt and in other parts of Africa. And it's very important that we keep up the momentum. And at the end of the day, if we don't push it, nobody will push it for us. So thank you once again and all the best.
Thanks, Farida. Malte?
Hi. I would also like to thank everyone for their active participation in this panel. This panel actually was very insightful for me myself in learning how Africa in general does do things in terms of accessibility. So thank you very much, Farida, for that. And thank you, Dan, as well, for giving us an inside scoop on what Facebook does in terms of helping people with disabilities. And of course, I'm sure that this is the beginning or the first step in a long journey that Facebook is planning to make it extremely accessible for people with disabilities. So I really want to thank you for that. And on behalf of Egypt, thank you for all the insights in this conference and through our panel and the previous panel. I think we were able to tackle a lot of issues regarding assistive technology and accessibility in Africa and the Middle East. So thank you all for that. And we want to create a platform in which we can have many of these different types of events or days or conferences, whichever you feel comfortable calling them as, so that we can always be up to date with what's new and share common experiences together for a better world. Yeah, that's it.
Thanks, Magdi. Over to you, Dan.
Thank you so much. As I hope I've conveyed at Facebook, we're excited about the future and the future of accessibility. And we're hard at work advancing that. We are able to get tremendous value out of accessibility features at scale, things using AI, for example, to make it possible to deliver automated services for people with disabilities. And that scale includes providing these services in a number of languages, but it's also important to understand that there are unique challenges and considerations and approaches to accessibility. And that's why I'm so grateful to Enable and to you, Irene, and the other panelists for helping us focus on what the accessibility challenges and needs are in Africa, and how we can tailor our products and our approach to be of most value to the users in Africa. So thank you. There's a lot more to do. We look forward to working with you to drive digital inclusion for the people with disabilities in Africa and around the world.
Excellent. So this has been an amazing discussion. It was interesting to listen to Farida, Magdi, and Dan as we all raise the different issues about what's going on across the world, but also across the continent. The reality for the African continent is that accessibility and assistive technology is still very new. For me, it's a big plus because we can leapfrog, adopt what the first world has already developed, and then it creates room for innovation for us to really solve the remaining local problems, African problems, come up with our own African solutions. So investments in education are very, very critical. I think that should be at the heart of any project that's going on. Number two, the issue of cost is huge across the world when it comes to accessibility and assistive technology. But I always say the only way we're going to solve this, especially in the continent, is that it has to start with the leadership. If you're a company, accessibility should be sitting at your CEO's office, because if it doesn't happen, then there'll be no allocation of budget and there'll be no buy-in from the rest of the teams. So it's very, very critical we make sure that our leadership buys into, if they buy into disability, then they need to embrace accessibility, because you can't embrace disability and your products are not accessible. At the same time, I want to commend the Kenya Bureau of Standards in Kenya for partnering with Enable and other stakeholders to at least develop a national accessibility ICT standard. And this is very, very critical because I do think it will be the first in Africa. It's a learning process. So we're going through the journey. And once we learn, we'll be more than happy to share with other African countries. But from there, it's all about the implementation. I think Farida raised an issue earlier where we said there are all these policies, but there's no implementation. So I definitely want to commend Zachary Lucorito and his team for embracing the partnership to be able to work together with people with disabilities to develop the standards. We don't want policies and standards developed by people in the office. No, people with disabilities need to be part of the process, and that's the way we get the buy-in. And last but not least, in terms of assistive technology innovations, because of the gap in education in Africa, I feel heavily that partnerships are the way to go between the first world organizations and the African continent. That's the only way we can learn from each other, we can transfer knowledge, and we can sort of push the agenda on assistive technology and digital accessibility. So I want to take this moment to thank all our fantastic speakers from the first and the second panel. I also want to say thank you again to Facebook for sponsoring this event. A recording will be made available on the Inclusive Africa website. And you can also sign up for our next webinar, which will be next month on the website as well. Please keep the conversation going. You can follow us at Enable.org, and you can use the hashtag A11Y Africa 2021. To end, we will play a short video on Accessibility XR from Debbie Girolamo from Facebook. For now, thanks to everyone, and you all have a fantastic day. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
We spend our days working on incredibly novel issues impacting new technologies. Safety, integrity, privacy, accessibility, and so much more. In short, we're helping to invent the future. Facebook's mission is to give people the power to build community and bring the world closer together. At Facebook Reality Labs, our mission is to give people the tools to feel connected anytime, anywhere. And this includes everyone. Our mission is ingrained in our work and is fundamental to what we do. Our world-class team of virtual and augmented reality researchers, designers, developers, and engineers work tirelessly to build the future of connection. Here, let me show you. I am currently inside Oculus venues, where I can meet up with and interact with colleagues, friends, and family, regardless of physical distance. Pretty cool, right? We believe that XR will not only provide new ways to interact, but will also transform the future of work, enabling equal access to virtual workspaces, regardless of mobility. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Many elements of the technological building blocks needed to create our future XR platform do not yet exist, and neither do many of the norms around their responsible development and use. Since our products and experiences have the potential to change the way people connect, work, and play, it is even more important to build the next computing platform in a responsible and inclusive way. To provide structure and consistency to our approach, we developed a set of foundational responsible innovation principles to guide us. Our 4 principles are: never surprise people, provide controls that matter, consider everyone, and put people first. But I want to focus on consider everyone. It is one of our core principles because we are committed to building inclusive and accessible products that everyone can enjoy. One thing we've done at the platform and ecosystem level was to create technical recommendations designed to help developers create more accessible VR software. We call these Accessibility Virtual Reality Checks, or VRCs for short. These VRCs are guidelines which aim to make Oculus Store apps inclusive so everyone can experience the wonders of VR. More broadly, we also actively seek input on our products and features from people with disabilities and the disability advocacy community. We sponsor and attend accessibility conferences to solicit feedback and conduct demos. We fund research, contribute to the standards guidelines for AR/VR, and engage in ongoing dialogue with advocacy groups on our product development and policies. We also actively contribute in working groups with community and industry-level organizations such as the World Wide Web Consortium, XR Access, and the XR Association, which we helped to found. For example, through the XR Association, we collaborated with accessibility leaders on the release of XR accessibility guidelines for developers, which promote the creation of accessible platforms that enhance experiences for all users. Internally, we also established the Facebook Reality Labs Accessibility Task Force as a grassroots effort to harness the interest of individuals across the business who want to improve the accessibility of our products, software, and content. The large number of individuals across the business dedicated to this effort, beyond just individuals with accessibility in their job title, allows us to include more diverse perspectives and to expand our impact. This task force also serves as a forum for us to bring in guest speakers. We've previously hosted leaders of the National Association of the Deaf, the European Disability Forum, and the XR Association, and we're looking forward to many more. We at Facebook Reality Labs are committed to doing this work and making continual progress towards improving the accessibility of our products. At Facebook Reality Labs, we truly are building the future, and we are committed to creating accessible and enjoyable technological solutions for all.